Good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Giselle Gopez, and I am the president of the Atlanta Area Evaluation Association. In a few minutes, we're going to get started with this evening's panel, Anti-Racism and Evaluation. But before we do, I just wanted to make note of a couple of things for you this evening. What you see here on your screen are the 6 panelists who will be presenting this evening. We wanted to provide ample time for discussion and Q&A, so we will not be reading their bios. However, you should have received a copy of their bios as part of the registration process, the reminder emails, and on the slide right here in front of you. We'll be providing a little bit more details about each of the speakers when we kick off, and we'll get started in about 1 to 2 minutes. Hi, everyone. For those of you who have just joined, just as a reminder, we will be getting started in about 1 minute. All right, so at 7:03 on my watch, we're going to go ahead and get started. So good evening, everyone. My name is Giselle Gopez, and I'm the president of the Atlanta Area Evaluation Association. And I am thrilled and honored to be able to host tonight's panel, Anti-Racism and Evaluation. As you know, over the past few months, the evaluation community has been discussing its role as evaluators in the recent call for social justice and work in anti-racism. The purpose of this facilitated discussion this evening is to gather together a group of esteemed evaluators who work in a variety of sectors, evaluation practices, and settings to discuss how their work contributes to anti-racism. I am very, very thrilled to be able to have Travis Tatum, who will be facilitating this evening's conversation. Before we begin, there's just a couple of housekeeping items that I did want folks to make note of. The first thing is that everybody will be muted during this call. If you have a specific question for any of the panelists, please be sure to use the chat box. We will be moderating the chat box throughout the evening, and your questions will be posed at the end of the panel during the Q&A portion of tonight's session. If it is for a specific panelist, please be sure to also write their name for who the question will be directed towards. We may not be able to get through all of the questions, but please note that we will be recording this evening's conversation as well as documenting all of the questions. So if there might be some follow-up following this evening's panel, and we may be able to respond to some of those questions at a later time. The next thing that we wanted you to make note of is that given that we have a very large number of attendees this evening, we will be sharing the screen. So if you want to have a view of the questions that are going to be posed along with the speakers, you just want to make sure you have your setting for your view options on side-by-side mode, where you can adjust the size of the slides and also be able to view the participants, which should be a column on the right side of your screen. Let's go ahead on to the next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, Travis Tatum, who is the founder and president of Creative Research Solutions, will be facilitating this evening's conversation. He is the founder and president of CRS, one of the few Black-owned evaluation and research firms in the city of Atlanta. And he's also a former president of AaEA, which I'm very thrilled and honored and pleased that he has agreed to facilitate this evening's discussion. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Travis, and we will go ahead and get started this evening with this very important conversation. Thank you, Travis, for facilitating this evening. I'll now turn over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And so before we begin, I just want to briefly introduce our speakers. I'm just going to say their names because we don't have time for the whole bio. So we have with us today Aisha Boyce, Assistant Professor at UNC Greensboro, Andrea Carter, Senior Project Delivery Specialist at Deloitte Consulting, Jory Hall, Associate Professor at the University of Georgia, Aisha Rios, Evaluator and Applied Anthropologist at Coactive Change, Lorna Rivera, Research Faculty at Georgia Tech, and Elizabeth Taylor Shiro Bidabinikwe, Evaluation and Research Consultant at the University of Minnesota. So I think we can go ahead and begin our discussion. So our first question is, what does it mean to be anti-racist in evaluation?
Sure, this is Aisha. I'm happy to get us started. So the first thing that I want to know is about the terms racism and anti-racism, and that these terms are not static, they're dynamic. Ibram Kendi says that racism and anti-racism are labels like peelable name tags that are placed and replaced based on what someone is doing or not doing, supporting or not supporting. And so that's one thing that I want us to keep in mind as we think about this discussion. And so to be anti-racist means that you support anti-racist ideas through your personal and professional work, and that you express the idea that racial groups are equal. That is kind of the foundation that we're working with. And in terms of how this can show up in our work, I'll say a little bit, and then Andrea's going to jump in. So I see this as showing up in your work. It's kind of a 4-step process, right? There's kind of 2 conceptual ideas and then 1 methodological idea. The 2 conceptual ideas, the first thing that you really have to do is you have to begin to learn about your own identities. We all have identities of power and privilege, as well as identities of oppression. We also have values, and so really working to unearth these values. The second thing is we need to know our history, especially the history of this country. So, and with the recognition that social science inquiry is a cultural product, right? And so racism and race is embedded into the very fabric of this country. And even though race, there's no differences between human beings according to genetics, race, even though it's a social construct, it very much impacts our everyday lives. So the thing that I've been seeing is a lot of people have been working on these first 2 things, getting to know themselves, learning about the history of this country. And I think that's great. But the next 2 items in terms of practice methodological is we have to begin getting comfortable having informal conversations about race. So people are uncomfortable talking about race because nobody talks about race. We use proxies like equity, diversity, and inclusion when we're really talking about anti-racism and white supremacy. And so we have to begin in our personal and professional lives, beginning comfortable having these conversations and saying these words. And then finally, it needs to show up formally in our practice. So this is including multiple stakeholder voices that wouldn't normally be heard, including evaluation questions about racism and equity and diversity and inclusion, making sure we have culturally commensurate instruments, and also in our reporting.
And so I guess my next question would be, given that, how has that, in your experience, how has that shown up in your work?
Do you want me to answer? I didn't know if Andre wanted to go.
Yeah, you can answer. Anyone could answer, I guess, but since it's a follow-up to your.
Sure. So showing in terms of how this has showed up in my work, especially, I feel like the informal piece is so important because a lot of evaluation work is interpersonal. It's not, the use of our results and our actual work isn't just what shows up in the final report. So, how that shows up in my work, I will see something like a microaggression in a meeting where someone is talking about, well, I don't know if this instructor can do as well because the students can't understand them because their accent. Or they will say, wow, this person looks really professional today because their hair is straightened versus being curly. And so it's really interrogating and coming with a curious spirit. I don't think it's really helpful to be like, racist. I don't think that's probably the way we want to go about it, but really interrogating and beginning to have these conversations, and then formally asking questions in my evaluation questions and making sure that the instruments have, if they haven't been validated with the population I'm using, then, you know, reconfiguring them and doing cognitive interviews and making them more culturally commensurate for the population I'm working on. I think being anti-racist in terms of formally starts from the very beginning to who do we talk to, who gets to sit at the table, who gets to help design the evaluation questions, all the way through to who gets a copy of the final report, who doesn't get a final copy of the report.
Okay. Would anyone else on the panel like to share their thoughts?
This is Andrea. I can add a few notes. I agree with how Aisha started us off today. I think a lot of the conversations that I've been a part of so far have focused a lot on sort of that interpersonal personal reflection, and I'm glad that we can move a little bit more into some of the action that we're taking to make a change. In addition to the steps that Aisha noted, I also wanted to add that having a reflective practice, I think, integrated as a part of our evaluation process will be really beneficial as a place where we can examine, you know, things like who we work with, who are the key decision makers, what's the diversity in experience, the identity of the people that we bring to the table. And also thinking about what counts as credible evidence and knowledge, and you know, really thinking about, you know, who the people are that are impacted by the program and policy that we're evaluating. And then I also wanted to add, I love that we started talking about the concept of racism and anti-racism. And I think that one thing that came up a lot in my discussions, at least, was the fact that, you know, being anti-racist in evaluation really requires us to actively work to dismantle systemic racism and the oppression of marginalized communities. And so thinking about how to build that into our practice, and how to, or thinking about the specific roles that we play in that.
And do you have any, I guess, so from the perspective of, you know, the other evaluators who may be in the audience, Andrea, do you have any thoughts or like specific approaches that you tend to use?
Not a particular evaluation approach. I mean, there are a lot that can apply. I mean, think about, you know, culturally responsive approaches and equitable evaluation, community-based participatory approaches, realist evaluation approaches. But a lot of that depends on, what we all know, the purpose of our evaluation and the questions that we're asking. And so I think we really need to think about the questions that we are including in our evaluation. You know, what questions are we not asking? And then have that discussion, and then think about what that means for the approaches that we're using and the frameworks that we're using.
Okay. I think that makes a lot of sense. So let's move on to the next question. In areas where anti-racism is not a topic of conversation, how do we as evaluators bring this lens to our work?
I can jump in on this.
I can answer that one.
Oh.
Okay.
Building off of what Aisha and Andrea were saying earlier, of like this idea that we need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. We need to demystify this idea of anti-racism as something that's far out there and something that we can't achieve as individuals without support. But because they're not, the people who are practicing racist thoughts and racist actions, you know, they're not dude on your Facebook they went to high school with, or your neighbor Lives Matter sign. They're your colleagues, they're your friends, they're your family, your mentors, your mentees, they're the folks that we do contract work with, they're our stakeholders, they're the people providing our funding, and they're us. And so we need to be okay with addressing these people. It's not easy work. And it starts with that heavy work of addressing ourselves and recognizing the work that we need to do as individuals, and looking at what our own identities are, how those are impacting our decisions and evaluation work. One example of bringing this lens to our work I have is, if you're in a meeting, and you notice that a white colleague is constantly interrupting and talking over a colleague who's Black, Indigenous, or person of color, you step up during the meeting, to say, Michael, I really appreciate your contributions to this discussion, but I've noticed that you are continually interrupting Tracy when they try to talk. I would like to hear what Tracy would like to contribute. Don't wait until after the meeting to tell Tracy that you noticed what Michael was doing and that you're sorry, because that's not going to help anyone but you. So Lorna, did you want to build on that?
Oh, actually, well, yeah, you can go ahead first, but I had a follow-up question for you when you're ready.
Go ahead, Travis. I don't want to interrupt.
Okay, so I guess my question was, so in that scenario, what's your recommendation for the person who may have less power in that situation? So for example, if you're, if you have that sort of interaction, but the person you're speaking to might be your supervisor or someone who's higher ranked than you in the organization.
So for me, it's not easy work practicing anti-racist actions and putting those into practice with these folks that we're with. And so it's measuring the level that you want to put that into practice and what that means to you and what that means to how you want to contribute to an anti-racist society. Because there's going to be chances and opportunities for you to jump in and do these types of things. And that might mean losing your job. That might mean that you don't get the project that you put a proposal in for. That might mean losing a friend, things like that. And so it's up to you on judging how much you want to put in and what that is worth to you.
So kind of like setting some boundaries for yourself and for the type of community that you want to be a part of.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Lorna, how about you? What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I really appreciated when Elizabeth said that we need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, and really engaging with our community and our neighbors and everything to talk about these critical issues. And for me, that really comes into play when I put into practice the approaches that I use. So typically the approaches that I use tend to be very values engaged. It's literally called the values engaged educative approach. And that requires an extreme amount of actual time being spent with whatever organization or project or participants that you're evaluating. So I know that sometimes evaluation that's not possible, especially now in the time of COVID, but some of the ways that might physically look like is just attending their meetings, being at any type of event that participants might be doing. I tend to work in the STEM world and mostly in academia. So there's a lot of meetings and there's a lot of presentations and a lot of seminars and a lot of, just stuff that you can go to and get to know people. I try to chime in and give an actual update on the evaluation, even if the update is no update, just so people get used to hearing me and being able to ask me questions in real time. I'll, like Aisha and Elizabeth were saying, I'll intentionally question some of the decisions they're making in real time or provide some data to support or contradict some of their assumptions. And yeah, just really getting to know their values. And then the other thing I really want to emphasize about all of this is that timing is really important. And I think that in order to make real progress, we have to time these discussions, which means we have to be present, and we have to be there and we have to engage, and or else you're just kind of like dropping in, saying something and then leaving, and you don't really even know if change happened. You know what I mean? Yeah,
that makes sense. So I guess, do you have any, do you want to share any examples of a time when you did actually get a chance to see change? You can leave out any names or organizations or anything like that.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do it. The projects I work on are they've come a long way. You know, this is being recorded and I will share it with them. Good job. So they've come a long way. So I remember when I first started on this one project, it's a nationwide 10-year, $235 million NSF project. So it's a giant. And it's for high performance computing. So, you know, not folks who are typically trained in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Not that they're not open to it, it's just not part of their main curriculum, right? So when they built their systems for providing resources to academic researchers, some basic things were not included for lots of reasons. So for example, when you create a profile, there's no demographic information. It's just name and email. And so it took some time, but I would say it took about 2 years. And for some people, that might be like really, really long, but you have to keep in mind that this program also existed for about 10 years before I started. So there's a lot, and there was
plus those big programs it just takes longer to move a big ship, so to speak.
Yeah, and like over 200 staff members. So there was a lot of people to meet with and literally convince that we should update the profile information to include those demographics. And one of the, just to sum this up real quick, but one of the carrots that I used for convincing folks in that conversation was that it's NSF funded. It was funded by the National Science Foundation, which values broadening participation. It's one of the main sections of proposals. So we were able to justify that change.
Okay. So let's move on to the next question. Let's see. So how is being anti-racist relevant or not relevant to your work?
So I can say that for me, it's critical, you know, in the world of STEM, there's so much inequity. It's stunning, you know, and it's just, and thankfully it's acknowledged and people believe that, I think, for the most part. So half the battle, I think, there is already won. There's usually not too much convincing to say that it's inequitable. However, finding ways to actually address that can be challenging because a lot of times, sometimes it's seen as such a big problem, well, you can't even make a difference. You know, people are like, well, it's a pipeline issue or whatever. They just kind of chalk it up to a lot of things. So one of the things that I do in my work, because the projects that I work on tend to live on for a really long time, whether or not I'm involved, is I try to make sure that that I put in place actual systems that can continue on their own for evaluating the project. So for example, the profile that I was telling you about. So making sure that demographics are included in the profile so that no matter what happens to me, we can track back demographics for years and years and years. And then same thing with like survey instruments that I developed for them and things like that.
Okay. Would anyone else like to respond to that question? I think that we've all hopefully have some experience with how being anti-racism is either relevant or not relevant for that matter.
I would like to just make a couple of comments. A couple of things that came to mind as other folks were speaking, and thank you all so much for kicking this off in such a great way. Lorna mentioned the values engaged approach. This was an approach that does squarely focus around issues of thinking about, okay, so the stakeholders that we work with, the folks that we claim we serve, certainly have values. We as individuals, we have values. What I think also gets not a lot of light is the fact that evaluation itself has values and its own culture. And so, as someone was saying earlier, we're working with a lot of all of these different cultures and perspectives and values. And so that's one piece I just wanted to highlight, that evaluation itself is part of a system. And we are, you know, grappling with that. In addition to, again, as Lorna was saying, the stakeholders' positions and, you know, our own position. So that's a thing. I wanted to give an example, which probably doesn't make me look good, but hey, that's okay. I was trying this values engaged approach because I think this example is meaningful for the reason that I'm about to share later after I share the example, which is to say, I said, okay, I'm an evaluator. I'm your friendly neighborhood evaluator. I come to you with this approach, the values, educative, engaged approach, whatever it was called at the time. And they're like, okay, cool, that sounds great. STEM project. I forgot, I think it was sports related or something, sports and science, I don't know. But the point was, when I was on the phone with the folks who were in charge of the program, and I was explaining the approach, which I recommend folks do, explain your values, explain the approach you intend to bring to this context. And the man said to me, well, this is not a diversity program, right? So now I'm like, pause, dramatic pause. Like, what do I say next? Because I've now revealed myself and it made it very clear my position, and he was not having any parts of it. And so in that case, it went nowhere, that stopped. In other cases, it's different, right? And I say all that to say is, this work is very hard. And I think it was Elizabeth who said earlier, sometimes you'll get the contract and sometimes it won't. It will cost you something to do this work. So I don't want to sound overly preachy or anything, but that really resonated with me, the cost of anti-racist work in the field of evaluation. Now there's softer ways to do it, of course, and you have to know your context and all of it, but you could be the nicest, sweetest person. And there it is. So I just wanted to bring some of those points to light. I hope what I said made sense and was.
No, that definitely made sense to me, and that's actually been our experience as well in some cases. But at least for me, I try to think of it as like not so much as a loss, but as an opportunity, because that means that the project that you didn't work on, if you had sort of not shared your position and your values, if you just tried to work on it anyway, like the fact that it wasn't aligned with your values would have created a lot of stress and tension, and it just would have, what I'm saying, like it kind of would have been a bad experience for you, for the client, and possibly for the participants, because there's a mismatch between your values and what you're trying to accomplish as an evaluator and what they are interested in trying to accomplish.
And Travis, I just wanted to jump in here. I know that we will be answering questions at the end, but I did want to point out, I think it's Corey from Public Profit, their comment here, just sigh, so frustrating. And in my opinion, it is a price that we white evaluators need to be ready to pay too. So thank you for that comment, Corey. And if there's any other thoughts on this as well, please keep sending them. And as a reminder, we'll be posing questions to the panelists at the end, but also the panelists themselves can also respond in the chat as well as they come in.
Can I say something really quick, Travis, about the cost?
Sure,
So,
yeah.
I just want to say something about terminology, and I just want to very quickly talk about the difference between an actor, an ally, and accomplice. So I'm hearing a lot of people using terminology right now. I'm an ally, I'm here for you, and this can be related to racism, this can be related to any other sort of ism, right? And I don't love the term ally, and I'm going to tell you why. Because an ally is always going to protect their base first. They're not going to go super far to extend themselves, right? They're going to, send some troops to help, but they're not going to try to let their country get invaded, right? So they're only going to go too far. And I really prefer the term accomplice. And I know that it's a negative terminology because it's like, oh, everybody's going to jail. But the reality is that to be anti-racist is to go against the system. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly the way that it was developed, the way it was made to work all the way back since, the early 1600s. And so an accomplice to me is someone who may lose work, who may lose face, as others have said, who may lose friends, but who's willing to put themselves out there for a cause that they believe in. I hear so many people say, well, oh, this is all about values. And it is about values. But I would say, especially for those of us who are on this panel, it's not just our values. It's a moral imperative. I can't, say, well, I'm going to, take off my anti-racist hat because I'm working with this group or because this project, is a broadening participation project. Like, this is who I am. And this is, I believe that evaluators need to be on the front lines doing this work.
I think that distinction makes sense. And I think that I guess I like it in one way, and I don't like it in another way. So the way I basically like it for the reasons that you described, but I guess sometimes I kind of also feel that the term ally is often the more accurate one in terms of like what like what our experiences may be working with different groups of people, and I think it is true that in a lot of times people do still kind of like, like they only are necessarily willing to go so far. So I think that it sort of depends on the specific person that you're dealing with in a specific situation, because sometimes you sort of have to think of someone as an ally, because that is so that you can have a more accurate prediction of how they're going to act, or like how they may respond, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I just dropped a link in the site called whiteaccomplices.org, which I think is a great resource that kind of goes over the difference between actors, allies, and accomplices. So I know that these are small nuances, and we're talking about like definitions, but I think words matter. So I just dropped that for those who are interested. Go ahead, Jory, sorry.
Okay.
I didn't want to interrupt what you were saying, Travis. Can I just make a small point?
Sure, go ahead.
Is that okay? So Aisha, I really appreciate your comment there and your resources there. I actually said something similar in that piece that I wrote in AJE. For those of you who don't know what that is, I'm sorry, the American Journal of Evaluation, my apologies. And this term came out of feminist work and standpoint theories in particular, and it was traitors. And it gets at exactly what you're saying with this idea of being disloyal, being a traitor to the system. And so it does have a rich history, what Aisha is pointing out. The second thing I want to point out is Travis's point, which is to say, we're conflating two different things. They're related, but it's being conflated. How we view non-people of color, and then how they view themselves. And what I'm suggesting is the folks that we traditionally call allies take up a stance of being a traitor or, a conspirator, because that's a mindset that I would like to see folks develop who are suggesting that, yeah, I'm really willing to do this work and not just say, I'm cool with what y'all doing over there.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to bring my perspective in there, because I think it kind of connects to what both of y'all are saying.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me, just because it's sort of like how people perceive themselves versus how you perceive them, and how they may perceive you. So the different terms, I think, are applicable for each, more or less so for different versions of that, or different for who is speaking to whom and who is being spoken about, if that makes sense.
So I'm going to take a quick pause here. I want to just make sure we've had the other panelists to be able to provide any thoughts. So thank you, Jory, Travis, and Aisha for providing your thoughts. Wanted to see maybe Aisha R., Elizabeth, Andrea. Did you have any, Lorna, what comments you might have had before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I'll jump in. One of the things that I wanted to highlight in thinking about the distinction between allies and accomplices is something really feels really important. So I was at a Black Indigenous-led community event this past Monday, and there was a lot of emphasis on, so I'll situate this in the context of what Aisha emphasized and described, like the first two aspect of being an anti-racist in evaluation that we often focus on, which is both exploring our own identity and then our own histories. And so one of the really important things I think to keep in mind is I see there's a tendency to do a lot of negative interrogation of our practices, and rightly so, a strong emphasis on white fragility and white privilege. But I wanted to elevate the fact that there are these amazing white accomplices, like John Brown, for example, who spoke out in the face of horrible atrocities against Indigenous and Black and Brown people. And so I want to lift that up because I think it's really important, because when we're thinking about our histories, there are people, our ancestors, who have fought back against injustices. And so there are, there are positive sources of inspiration, people who put their lives on the line, and despite it all. So just wanted to lift that up.
Okay, that is definitely appreciated.
I can jump in, Travis.
Yeah.
I want to build right off that, Aisha. I know Jory said earlier she didn't want to preach, but I will. And looking at this question of like, how is being anti-racist relevant or not to your work? It is relevant to everything. It is relevant to everybody's work. And I will preach that from the moon, and that every system and power structure that is in place was created from white supremacy, imperialism, and racist acts. And so it is up to us. Evaluation is not an exception to any of this, and that it's up to us to continue pushing back against those until those structures have been erased and people of color and Indigenous people are put back into those stories and power structures that create the societies that we're in.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I'm actually kind of curious though, before we move on, is there anyone on the panel who would say that that being anti-racist was not relevant to their work? Yeah, that's right. I figured that.
I do want to add one thing though.
Okay, sure, go ahead.
It is 100% relevant to my work, for the record. But one thing I want to say is, like, what does this look like in real life? You know what I mean? Like on a day-to-day, typically it's usually not a really like blatant offense. You know what I mean? Like, what do you do with the little stuff? Or sometimes it is blatant. I don't know, on the regular for you. It depends on your context. But I did want to give one example that really changed me and my approach to what I did. So the very first time I did a climate study with a client at an HPC center, a high performance computing center, I wanted to ask demographic questions on the climate study because that is what you do. And they didn't want that. They thought that they didn't have issues between demographic groups. And I remember I was junior researcher at the time. I had very little power in the project. My boss at the time was a senior professor, a lot of power, but not necessarily in this project either. She was new on the project. And I remember her literally kind of tapping me under the table because, I was about to be upset. And it was just kind of one of those like reassuring, like, wait for it. You know what I mean? And it kind of goes back to the timing. And she literally said to them, okay, we're planning on doing the study next year, right? And they said yes. And she said, okay, well, why don't we see what happens with this one? And then we can reassess that next year. And sure enough, it came out on the climate study in the comments that there were issues with gender. And so we brought that up, we presented it, and we said, hey, remember when we said that? We understand that maybe that was possibly even a scary thing for you to look into, but now we're seeing evidence of that. What do you think about us moving forward and investigating it? It just so happened they said, yes, investigate it, let's do that. And we've never looked back. And we have like an entire section on equity now. But that's where I kind of come back to timing, time it out, level-headed, try it, see what happens, ask clarifying questions, and then hopefully people can work with you. And if they can't, that's part of the cost that everybody's talking about. Sometimes you just gotta be like, it's not me, it's you.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely appreciate that example. And also thank you, Elizabeth, for your earlier comments about dealing with microaggressions, because that kind of like blended both of those. So definitely appreciate that. So let me move on to the next question though, which is, what can we personally and professionally do to up our game in this work?
I'll jump in. I love this question. So I think it's a complex and huge question. And I think in many ways, it's very much up to you, not just where you are at professionally, but where you are at personally. but where you're at, but also where you're willing to go and the risk that you're willing to take, with an understanding that this might shift over time, and it might shift depending upon what's going on in your life. It might shift depending upon the other work that you're involved in and the resources you have available to you, whether or not you can say no to something or push back to the extent that you lose work. But for me, I think one of the things I've been thinking about a lot the past year is about action. And so while I think the focus on understanding our own identities and our own histories and those in the communities in which we operate, I think for me, really upping my game is about doing things and who I'm engaging with and the work that I'm engaging in and the work that I'm not engaging in. And so what that looks like for me is really taking a hard look at my time and saying, this is the kind of work that I want to engage in, and this is the kind of work I don't want to engage in. So that might mean me saying no to something. What that looks like right now is me spending a lot of my time engaging in Black, Indigenous, Black-led organizing around abolition, unpaid work that I believe I have a moral obligation to engage in that work because I've decided that that's how I want to spend a lot of my life. And I don't want to spend a great deal of my time operating in systems and institutions that really contribute to the systemic oppression of BIPOC, LGBTQ, basically anyone who does not identify as straight, white, cisgender man, able-bodied person, right? So, so I think it's a very much a personal decision, but also it's something that it will shift over time and what you feel comfortable with, and the risks that you're willing to take and what you're willing to sacrifice.
Yeah, just for the sake of the audience, because I know what you're talking about, but they may not know what abolition means. So you might want to explain that. Yes.
So abolition refers to the completely abolishing the prison industrial complex. So prisons, policing, criminalization, all of the aspects of policing and criminalization, not just within like formal systems, but how they operate throughout so many of the systems in which we operate. So what that looks like, it's not just about dismantling or abolishing these systems that oppress so many communities, oppress all of us, honestly. It's also about creation. So imagining a world in which punishment is not the response to harm. So if someone harms me or harms someone else, we have a tendency to say, okay, well, they need to be punished because they're a bad person, they did this bad thing. But what if we could approach harm with love and healing and care, and creating space for healing rather than punishment?
Okay, thank you. I think that was very clear. I saw a hand raised from Elizabeth.
No, I was applauding Aisha.
Okay.
All the abolition work, I'm right there with you. I worked for the Minnesota Freedom Fund and in that prison industrial complex work and doing bail and bond, and she just described it perfectly and got me super excited, more excited.
Okay. So would anyone else? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Travis. I got excited too.
Yeah, all right.
I don't know about anybody else. I am having a really good time. So I thought about this question too, and we already covered, being a trader and these kinds of things, which is hugely important, from my perspective. The other thing I was thinking about is this whole notion of like non-racist versus anti-racist. This came up in an article I was reading. Lots of things come across my desk, but anywho, one way to think about this is that, we often I hear people say, oh, I'm a good person, right? I don't do like these folks over here, meaning like, I'm not like the KKK, right? I'm not doing X. And so they rely on the fact
hopefully the bar is higher than the KKK.
Well, but it's right, but you get the idea, right?
Yeah.
That I'm not doing this over here. I'm a good person, so therefore. And I think anti-racism pushes that, like was said before, to more action. The other thing in terms of the self-critique, a lot of times when you read the literature on, and I write this literature on culturally responsive work, we center, as was said before, this idea of self-critique. But what I want to problematize is the notion that self-critique begins with this idea that I'm a good person. Can we just pause for a second, right? And I'm all for healing and caring. At the same time, I think this idea that if I self-reflect, starting from the place that I'm naturally good and I have these good intentions, right? That does something. And I'm suggesting that why don't we start from a different place, right? That my intentions could be suspect. And I think anti-racist stance might ask us to do something more than always defer to the fact, well, I'm a good person, right? My intentions are good. And I'm coming from a very wholesome, natural place. And so I just wanted to put that out there, that I think self-critique also requires us to question our good intentions. It puts it all up there. The other thing is, in terms of methods, oftentimes we say we want to do more participatory collaborative work. Well, in my reality, that's not always feasible. Why? Because of COVID and time and budget. What I would encourage all of us to be thinking about, to up our game, as the question says here, would be to say, let's not focus so much on making sure necessarily that everybody goes through all the phases. That's important. It is. And if you can do it, I'm so thrilled for you. But what I'm suggesting is maybe upping our game might mean that we focus on the quality of the involvement that these participants have and the consistency rather than the quantity. Because frankly, the people I work with, they don't want to do some of this stuff. And I can't force that on them, right? They really do want to defer to me and be positioned in certain aspects. And lastly, I would just say that failures. So this is a bad, naughty word for some reason in our society. But I wrote a piece where I talked about all my evaluation boo-boos. And what I'm saying to you is that to up our game, I think we could really focus on what are we not doing quite right. If this is truly a process, if this is truly a moral commitment, as Aisha said, ethical practice, then we will struggle with how to do it. And it's fine to want steps and recipes, but I've made a lot of mistakes that we could learn from, we could benefit. So that could generate very deep learning. And just lastly, I'm sorry, but this is really like my heart and how we think about the stakeholders. We focus a lot on knowing. Well, if we just know about their culture, that would be so helpful. Knowledge attainment. We gotta keep learning more about them. Well, here's the thing. Here's the thing about anti-racism. No matter how much I know about a cultural group, they will always exist beyond my knowledge of them. They always will. And so I just think that if I come to the stance of like not knowing, right? Like accept it. I can never know enough. I'm continuously going to be learning. This might be a better thing to emphasize is what I'm trying to say. I think we know it, but like, I really would like to see us emphasize this more. So I'm done. this is very important work.
I just want to jump in here and just point to a comment that Amy Smith shared in the chat. Amy, is it okay if I read your comment aloud? I think you're on camera. Well, I'm going to read your comment aloud. So it says, she writes, I really appreciate all of these ideas and perspectives regarding the topic of timing and risk of action. As a white anti-racist in my personal and professional life, I sometimes struggle with not jumping in right away to speak to a racist issue when that in itself might harm BIPOC, i.e. hearing the white oppressive perspective again and again, being called out as a person impacted, etc. I walk this line between asking permission and following BIPOC leadership in this work and wanting to take on the burden of the work and to educate and have shared learning in the dismantling of white supremacy, other white people. I know it's both and it's a place of struggle for me. So I've heard, comments and reflections like this from some of my other colleagues and friends, and I'm curious, and I know I'm going out of line here with what I said we would do, but it's such a timely comment based on the conversation that we're having right now. I'm curious for the panelists, what are your reactions to this? This is not an uncommon feeling. How do we come together and have a conversation about this, and how do we move forward? We have a lot of conversations like this one, but what's the reaction about this when someone comes to a topic to you about something like this? I'm gonna open this up to everybody on the panel.
I can hop in because I was going to give some examples of what does this look like in practice. And so what I would like is for my colleagues to pick up this work and share the burden with me, right? No, regardless of what it is. Yesterday, I gave a talk about supporting graduate students of color. And I said, hey, just faculty of color cannot only be the mentors and supporters of people of color. So I think that it's the same thing with this type of anti-racist work. It can't just be BIPOC people who are taking up and doing this important work. Everyone has to pick it up. Everyone has to be committed to it. And so I'll just give two examples of what this looks like. And so the first is adopting an anti-deficit orientation. I often work with clients where they say, these students aren't doing as well, what can we give them? Or this community doesn't have this, what can we give them? And it's like, okay, well, I'm not opposed to giving people of color money, but in terms of various projects, but we might think about, instead of saying, well, why isn't this student doing well? Maybe we can give them some mentoring. Probably what we need to say is, what is wrong with the culture within this environment that this group is not doing as well? So it's a reframing of our thinking from what's wrong with this group to like, what's wrong with the culture, what's wrong with the environment, and how can we change this environment so that we all can be thriving? I think that is such a huge distinction. It's small, but I think it's like a flipping the switch. Joy had asked a question, I saw it going through, about culturally commensurate instruments. And so I work with Gabby Garcia, who's on with a project with evaluating a program at University of Puerto Rico, Humacao. And they actually fired their first evaluator because her thought of being anti-racist or being, being culture responsive was to just like translate everything in Spanish, right? Like all the instruments in Spanish. But if you know anything about Spanish, all Spanish is not the same. First of all, let's start there. Some snaps for that. Secondly, translating Spanish is not enough. Like, just like Jory said, there's no group is homogenous.
Content matters.
Exactly, right? And so what we've had to do was because someone asked this question, like, how do you do this? So what we did was we took some instruments, some climate study instruments that were already validated, brought them over, met with our stakeholders, and went through every single question with them. And they said, well, this doesn't make sense. We actually don't call people Black in Puerto Rico. Like we went through every single question. Then we piloted it. And then we did cognitive interviews, and we said, well, does this make sense? Does this make sense? And the reality is then now we're in the process. So then we did it and we felt really good about it, but it looks completely different than the validated instrument. And now what we're doing is we're now going back and doing confirmatory factor analysis to make sure that to like revalidate these validated instruments because they weren't originally validated with this group. And so this work, it takes extra work. It takes extra time, and you just have to be committed to that. So in terms of like what my colleagues can do is I want them to speak up. I think it was Elizabeth or someone gave the example. I cannot stand when things happen in meetings and then someone texts me afterward and is like, wow, that was really disrespectful. Like, can you believe that? That was kind of racist. Yeah, so as you texted me afterwards, like I would love for you to actually say something in the moment. So what I want is my colleagues to stand up and share this burden with me because, I'm gonna keep going for as long as I can, but it would be great if we could all share the responsibility, all commit to this work.
Yeah, and that actually brings something to mind as well for me. And this I think is specifically applies to the folks who are at small organizations or who are independent consultants, because that work is really important, but it does take a lot of extra time, and it's really easy to if you haven't planned ahead for it, it's really easy to end up either not being able to do it or having to do it for free. which is definitely not ideal. So that's something that I always like to make sure that we plan ahead for, because it does take a lot of time and it does add a lot of work.
I'll jump in. Something
Yeah.
that I've been thinking a lot about. I am an independent consultant, and one of the things that I've begun doing is pushing back on RFPs that want the moon and the stars, particularly around anti-racism work, and to say, okay, so my colleague Kai Fierley-Hedrick and I wrote a one-page statement that we've been putting in with RFPs, responses to RFPs, to say, okay, I understand that you want all of this work done within 6 months to a year, for $10,000, but that's not realistic. And really emphasizing the fact that in order to do this work, you need more time. In the front end, one of the big challenges, to your point, Travis, around budgets often is that, oh, there's no space to do the front end work of building relationships and really gaining a deep holistic understanding of the context in which the work is happening. There's such a tendency to rush to action, develop an evaluation plan, collect data, analyze it, produce a report. And there's no space for the relationship building and the interpersonal relational work that's necessary to be able to gauge timing and push back on people. But having a relationship with them to do that is essential, right? So it's absolutely about building in time into our budgets for thought partnership, for relationship building, like putting that in the proposals, right? Put that in our budgets, because if you don't carve space for it, it's so easy to get caught up in the hustle and you're just moving through implementing the plan that you have in place without pausing to reflect critically on whether or not things are working or feeling sticky or there's tensions that are showing up. So just something to lift up.
So yeah, definitely agree, and we definitely have a lot of experience dealing with that over here at Creative Research Solutions as well. Actually, Andrea, how about you? How has your experience been as far as like making these types of plans and projects?
Yeah, so actually, I wanted to add a little bit with what Aisha Rios was just saying about making sure that we take the time to reflect. And I think I mentioned that earlier, but it's just really important to take a step back and see what we're doing. And as evaluators, I mean, I think it's important that we take a critical lens to how we approach the work that we're doing. And I think that what Aisha Boyce mentioned, they both did a really good job of really in plain terms, talking about why taking the time for this is important. And I think that we should take that into our work as well, as we're talking with the key decision makers and stakeholders that we're working with. It's really important to use plain language. And I know we have a lot of evaluation jargon, but they both did a really great job of speaking about why it's important to have the timeline and why we need to take the approach that we're taking. And so what I found when working with people who are not evaluators is that it's really helpful to use plain language and talk about, well, why do I need this extra time? What am I getting from this instrument now that I didn't get before? And what is this going to do for me? And how is it going to help answer the questions that we have? And for program staff, a lot of times it's how can explaining to them what it means for the people that they are working with.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Let's see. Do we have time for more responses?
Yeah, we have 8 o'clock is when we'll open up the Q&A.
Okay, so we have a minute. Would anyone else like to respond?
Yeah, I will. And I see like a few folks in the chat like wanting to know like these concrete, like what can I do? What kind of like methods are there? That kind of stuff. But I actually want to zoom out a little bit from that because it starts a lot earlier than that when things are put into practice that involve racist thoughts and actions. And so starting from the beginning of like upping our game to me looks like not responding to those RFPs that would be better served by evaluators of color, and looking at like what Aisha was saying of like, we're already a step behind because we don't have that time to build in relationship building. But when especially when we're not from those communities, it's going to take a lot more. And they might be better served by evaluators who have been part of communities or similar communities that might be a better fit for it. So not responding to those or handing them off to colleagues that you think might be better fit for it. It's, inviting your mentees or your students who are Black, Indigenous, person of color to contribute to your manuscript and then putting their name first. It's not I felt a lot of collective sighs with that one. It's intentionally, looking at the racial makeup of your colleagues if you're in a consultant agency, wherever you're at, where you work, and then realizing when they're, 90% white, then approaching your supervisor to say, I've noticed that an overwhelming majority of our staff are white. And I think that this limits the type of perspectives and lived experiences that we want as part of our work. If you're the owner, the supervisor, the CEO, and you realize that 90% of your staff are white, then intentionally seeking, hiring Black and Indigenous folks of color during the next hiring opportunity. And if one isn't possible in the meantime, then intentionally creating space for your current employees to learn more about Black, Indigenous folks of color and their experiences within the area that you work in, whether that's public health or whatever nonprofit work that you're doing, university settings and other spaces. It's giving more space to your Black and Indigenous and person of color colleague that you're writing a manuscript or proposal with. And I think it was Jory that said it earlier. It's acknowledging when you've messed up and then fixing it and being vocal about it so that others can learn from how you made the mistake and how you can work from it and help others in other communities. There's always going to be opportunities to up our game, and it's not easy work because it's never going to be easy addressing racism and racist thoughts, especially when it's our own or our friends and our colleagues. It's always going to be really difficult. And I'm going to tell you something that you may not know, that you're not going to get a certificate in being an anti-racist. When you practice anti-racist acts, no one's going to jump out, spray glitter at you and play trumpets. And your boss isn't going to give you a gold star and give you tenure. It's important for you to do that work because it's important to contribute to communities that are not your own and that have been just in the past.
Thank you. So now, as I understand it, it's time to move on to our Q&A session. Let's see.
Yeah, so it's we have the questions here. So we're just gonna go ahead. We've been copying and pasting the questions that were in the chat. I think one of the questions that was posed earlier in the evening, it's a little bit lengthy, so let me go ahead and just read this. So for the panelists, how should the field of evaluation address the increasing absence of descriptive representation moving forward? There's a little bit more context provided. My question is about descriptive representation versus substantive representation when it comes to anti-racism. Descriptive representation is when a person represents people based on identity characteristic or characteristics they have, such as being Black, identifying as LGBTQIA+. Substantive representation is when a person represents the interests of a group of people regardless of their identity characteristics, i.e. espousing and acting on anti-racist practices and policies, advocating for education reform. I think both descriptive and substantive representation are important, but we are seeing a shift toward increasing substantive representation without descriptive presentation. So I think the question here is, how should the field then address the increasing absence of descriptive representation moving forward? It's a little bit lengthy, so let me copy and paste.
Yeah, would anyone like to? I was going to say, would anyone like to respond? So full disclosure, I think that is someone from our team who asked that question.
Well, I'll add a nuance to the question. I think, so, on the one hand, we're talking about, so with descriptive, representation. Of course, like one of the risks is tokenism, right? Like, okay, well, we're going to bring a Black person. We're going to bring someone with this background. And so I think there's challenges where your focus is just on diversification and bringing descriptive representation as the person, the way they frame this question. Because if you're bringing in just people who look a particular way without paying attention to their politics, their values, the knowledge and experience you bring to the table, then like that is tokenism, right? Because you're not actually being attentive to the qualities and values and strengths and knowledge that they bring. And that's what we should be really centering, not just someone based on the color of their skin, right?
So I think from my understanding, I think the question was trying to center both of those things at the same time. So saying that if you only have, like you still have a problem if you only have one, even if the one that you have is substantive representation, or is that, would you agree with that, or?
So, right, so it's important. It's important to capture both, not if you solely are focusing on external appearance, and you have to consider lived experiences, because for thinking about any particular community, there's so much diversity. I mean, I represent so many different communities and cultures. So it's, I think we talk about things like community representation. There's a tendency to homogenize groups, right? Communities and cultures. And there's so much variation and diversity of experience within cultures and communities. So I think that's something else that's important to keep in mind.
Okay. Does anyone else want to respond to that question before we move on to the next one?
I'll build off of what Aisha was saying, just to say that, like, yes, like both are important, especially within evaluation. We can't have just descriptive representation because there's not enough Black, Indigenous people of color in evaluation. So if we were off of that, there wouldn't be enough of us. There aren't enough of us. And so that's why we need these accomplices to step up and help do the fight with us, because there's not enough for us to be in these positions based solely off of descriptive representation.
Great. I think we have another question. I think, Alicia, you're going to go ahead and read that question.
Okay. Our next question is, can you say more about the difference between saying that you're anti-racist versus saying that you're not racist?
So would anyone like to respond to that question?
I can just, okay, let me just say this. This is a really good book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. He is not, the Messiah come back. I don't agree with everything he said. I know there's some people who are like, I think his work is foundational and it's a good starting point. Let me just put that caveat before I just kind of read this from his book. So,
okay.
He says that there is no in-between safe space of not racist. So the claim of not racist, neutrality is a mask for racism. It is a descriptive, and the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it and then dismantle it. So he says that what's the problem with being not racist? It's a claim that signifies neutrality. And we know from Desmond Tutu that when you're quiet in systems of injustice, you're siding with the oppressor, right? So there is no neutral point. Either you're racist and you're just not saying anything about it, or you're anti-racist, you're actively working to dismantle systems and thoughts. So that's my understanding, according to Kendi, of the difference between anti-racist and not racist.
So there was a follow-up question to that, because there was another audience member, Aisha, who then said, can one really truly, I'm adding the really truly, but can one be an anti-racist? It seems more like one can do anti-racist practices, just like we shouldn't call ourselves an ally, or as Aisha was saying, accomplice, but rather do practices towards allyship and accomplishship. So can you really be an anti-racist, or are you just doing the motions of being an anti-racist?
Yeah, they may not have been here when I started off the conversation, but I mean, the term racist and anti-racist are dynamic. They're not static. It's not like a label that you wear for the rest of your life. Like, okay, well, now I'm in the anti-racist group.
Yeah.
It has to do with every.
Oh, you're back.
It has
You're
to do with
back.
actions. Yeah, exactly. It has to do with your actions. So you may do something and you're racist, right? You've done this, you've had this racist thought, you've done this racist thing. And the next day you may turn around and be like, oh my gosh, let me take stock of this. Let me move forward and move yourself back into the anti-racist. So I think it's just like being culture responsive. There's no such thing like I'm culture responsive now. It's a journey, not a destination.
Yes, and I just like that's so.
Makes sense to me.
Sorry, that's so important. It's not an identity, right? And I think there's it's really it's something that we like to do, right? We want to put people into buckets and put ourselves into categories, and I think it's so important to think about these as practices, lifelong practices that we have to work at continuously forever. We're not culturally competent. We're not anti-racist. It's not a noun, right? It's a journey and a practice. And I think it's so important because if we think of ourselves in this like boxed way, we start feeling inadequate. We start not speaking up, so I think there's risk in fixing yourself in this way. And if you think about this in terms of a practice, then it opens up space for acknowledging when you make mistakes and looking for opportunities to do better.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's when I saw that comment in the chat, I was like, yes, because in my opinion, that's what it is as well. It's not a destination that you're trying to get to. And that's sort of my point when I say you're not going to get a certificate for being an anti-racist. Like there's not a degree for it. And looking at even the folks that are on this panel, like we're not experts in being anti-racist. Like we are just passionate about putting those anti-racist practices into being. Nobody is ever going to be completely anti-racist. And that's one of my criticisms of even Kendi's book is that I don't think there's an anti-racist person. I think that it's a way of being that we'll always be working on, and we're always going to be working on being better at that and feeling more comfortable with that. But what's important about it is not trying to figure out how you can be an anti-racist person, but how you can start intentionally looking for how you as individuals are contributing, not you, we, because all of us are contributing to racist systems, structures, practices, and then finding those opportunities where you can intentionally practice anti-racism by asking questions, inserting yourself when your Black, Indigenous, or person of color colleagues can't, and to just stop being quiet. You need to make some noise.
That's really I think that's really on point, and I would like to actually talk more about it, but I think we unfortunately have to wrap up our conversation. So I will pass it to Giselle to close us out. And I just want to thank everyone on the panel for taking the time to be here, and for all of your insights and thoughts, and also I really appreciate our audience today for asking so many amazing questions. And I see there's been a lot of dialogue happening in the chat as well, so definitely appreciate that as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Travis, for facilitating this evening's conversation, and for all of our panelists. Before I close it out, I'm going to pop it over to Sheen, who will just give a quick announcement, and then we'll talk about the next steps following today's conversation.
So actually, going along with the current election spirit, AaEA will be having our 2021 council election in December. So AaEA members, please be on the lookout for an announcement for nominations in late October, and more details on the timeline will be posted there. And thanks to you all again for this very fruitful conversation. I learned a lot.
Thank you, Sheen. So there were a lot of comments that were in the chat, a lot of questions that we were not able to get to this evening, and a lot of resources that were posted. So we will actually be sending out the resources that were shared from this evening's conversation And one question that was posed, I do hope that the group can reflect on this evening, and maybe we'll do a follow-up, either a conversation or we'll send out an email just on the panelists' thoughts, and we'd love to hear from you as well. Just thinking about, as we close out the night, how might the concepts of harm and care and loving and healing show up in evaluation? So on that note, and on behalf of the Atlanta Area Evaluation Association, special thank you to Travis, Elizabeth, Aisha Boyce, Jory Hall, Aisha Rios, Andrea Carter, and Lorna Rivera for your evening, for your thoughtfulness, and just for making us be a little bit more reflective in the way that we do this work. I do hope that if there are other affiliates and evaluators out there that are willing to perhaps collaborate for future discussion, and also start to do some more workshops in the ways that we can improve our skills and the way that we do the work, please reach out. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful evening, and we ended exactly at 8:15. Take care, everyone.
Take care.
I have a question.
Oh, yes.
Will this recording be available to members to see later?
Yes, it will be available to everyone. We are going to have the recording posted, and we will notify all of the registrants from this evening.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for joining.